I thought I'd make a short video that talks about some of the elements of plot. This is to go with this week's discussion of this particular aspect of fiction. In addition to the word plot, sometimes we call this narrative, sometimes we call this structure in a story. So if you see those other terms, what we're really talking about is the plot, the action of the story. As you saw on the first slide, I gave you some page numbers from our textbook that covers this, and I'm going to cover very briefly some of the elements that they talk about in that section on pages 849 to 853. The first thing that they discuss is, of course, comes from Aristotle, the 4th century BC Greek philosopher who invented a lot of our notions of how fiction, how drama, how tragedy, how poetry works. He also invents rhetoric, by the way, how we organize an argument to persuade people. He's the one who developed the idea that all stories have to have a beginning and a middle and an end. And that may seem like a blinding flash of the obvious to most of us, but given the context of his time when fiction didn't really exist in the way that we think of fiction, it was a pretty revolutionary development to set down rules that says that stories have to have a logical starting point, they have to have a middle that naturally follows from the beginning, and an end that has some kind of resolution, or as Aristotle writes in the Poetics, nothing after it. It's a complete action. That's not necessarily a definition that we always follow these days, but it's certainly one that you might want to take into account. Another definition that comes from an earlier reading in the course comes from author Margaret Atwood, who is pictured here, when she says, so much for endings. Beginnings are always more fun. True connoisseurs, however, are known to favor the stretch in between, since it's the hardest to do anything with. And there she's talking about the middle, Aristotle's idea of the middle. She goes on to say, that's about all that can be said for plots, which anyway are just one thing after another, a what and a what and a what. And you remember reading that when we looked at the story Happy Endings early in the course. So from Atwood's perspective, we find that plot is not all that interesting. It's difficult. It's hard to make characters do what you want them to do from her perspective. And as you saw from taking a look at Happy Endings, she offers you 6 different versions of the same story, 6 different plots. She doesn't choose any of them as being superior to the other. She really tells you in the beginning that version A is the happy ending. And I think, frankly, she's being ironic about that. On this particular screen, you can see 2 photographs. This is Dana Gioia, and this is R.S. Gwynne, who's one of the writers, the 2 editors of our textbook. And what they talk about on these 3 pages in the textbook is the idea that a plot is, first of all, a movement in time. That is, it's a chronological sequence that starts at a certain point and continues, following by time. Not necessarily real time, but there's a passage of time from where a story begins to where it ends. This can be very short. It can be very long. It depends on the nature of the text. The second thing that they say is that it's a movement in causality. That is, that one thing causes another to happen. As the story goes on, characters interact with each other, they interact with their environment, they interact with their circumstances, and things begin to happen. One thing affects something else. And so events occur in sequence, or as Atwood would say, the what and the what and the what keep happening over and over. The third thing that they talk about, and this is, I think, maybe the part that keeps us reading fiction, is this idea of a movement in dramatic tension. When we start reading a story, the first thing we do is we suspend our disbelief, as St. Augustine says. And when we do that, we assume at some level the characters that we're reading about, the places that we're reading about, are somehow real. Even if they're a made-up place, like in fantasy fiction, for instance, we assume subconsciously that we're watching something that could really have happened in a real place, in a real moment in time. Those of you who are Game of Thrones fans, which I have actually never seen, um, that's set in a mysterious place, in a time that's obviously in the past. And when we look at the elements that we see on the screen, we can tell that it looks like Western Europe sometime maybe around 1000. And so we understand the technology, we understand the way the people are dressed, we understand their actions in that context. It would look weird if in Game of Thrones a spaceship showed up, or if you were watching a movie about the Roman legions, for instance, like the 300, or Gladiator, and suddenly someone showed up with a machine gun or an atom bomb. Well, that would not be a logical thing to have happen. So, or would it be realistic? But we assume that the scenery, the characters are all real people doing real things in a real point in time, in place, in space. But even if it's not a real place, we just make that assumption. So the point here is that we make an investment of our time, of our psychic energy, of our emotional capacity into the characters and the action that we see. We want to be moved in some way. We want to be excited or scared or amused, or as a minimum, we just want to have enough to keep us going, to keep reading it. And those of you who read thrillers, which is mostly what I read, detective stories and, spy stories and things like that. I read carloads of that kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff that keeps me interesting. What's going to happen next? And so that dramatic tension should rise as the story goes on to a point where we're so invested that we just want to stay with it no matter what until it ends. Now, most stories are fairly straightforward in presenting these three elements. Sometimes authors will experiment with this. They won't be necessarily organized chronologically. You might start in a particular moment, flash back to an earlier event. You might even flash forward and then come back to the present. Some artists, some writers will play around with time in that way. Some authors will also foreshadow something that's going to happen later in the story. They'll set up a set of circumstances or a character or an environment or an object usually, that's somehow going to pay off later in the story. And then we'll go, oh, I remember that. I read about that on page 5. And here it is again at page 15. Something else we find, and again, this comes from a lot of what I call genre fiction, that is stories written to entertain, stories that we don't usually regard as great literature, compelling though they are, is the idea of a mystery story. And like I said, I read a lot of detective stories, and I'm sure many of you watch detective shows on television or through a streaming service. And those are all mysteries. Who did it? When did they do it? Why did they do it? And these are all things that authors play with. There's also the idea of coincidence. And coincidence is interesting because sometimes we'll decide that a coincidence is forced, that it's out of place, that it shouldn't be allowed to happen. And then other times we'll look at a coincidence and we'll say, how interesting is that? Well, of course, that's absolutely what really happens. And what appears to be a coincidence might be something that's very carefully constructed. Here's a series of more terms. Now, one of the things that some of you might be concerned about is, do I expect you to use these terms in your papers? And the short answer is yes, but only if you are comfortable using them and only if you fully understand them. And again, I'll have to send you back to our textbook for more help with this, because some of the definitions that I may use may or may not match exactly what's in the textbook. I would say you can probably never go wrong with using our textbook as your source. They talk in this section about something called Freytag's Pyramid, and this is a 19th century drama convention where throughout a story there's kind of what's called a dramatic arc, where we start at one place and the tension rises and rises and builds as the story goes on. And this was invented by a 19th century German critic, I think it's Paul Freytag. And here he is, in case you were wondering what he looked like. And so this is kind of the basic structure that we expect stories to take us through, that there's some beginning that moves us through a middle that reaches some kind of a high point of some sort, and then there's a falling off of that as the story comes to an end, and we conclude wherever we conclude. Stories often include what's called exposition, and this is some of it's simple stuff. Who are the characters? Where are we? What time period is this set in? What place is this set in? Things like that. And you certainly see that in the stories that we read. If you go back to Atwood's happy ending story, however, there's no real clear setting for that. It seems to be domestic middle class life, but we don't know where it is or when it is. And of course, she does that on purpose because she wants us to think about these stories as being universal. And I'll talk about that here in a second. So that's the first thing. Exposition kind of sets out what the story is going to be about, who's there, what they're doing, where they're doing it, and when they're doing it. The complication or conflict, and all stories have to have some kind of conflict in them. And the conflict might be something as simple in a mystery as who's the guy who did this? Why did they do it? That's the conflict. And the conflict is between the people who are trying to solve the case and the murderer or the thief or whoever's committed the crime. Okay, so that's that kind of conflict. Sometimes you see interpersonal conflict, as we do in a story like Sonny's Blues, for instance, where you've got two brothers who are in conflict most of their lives, and the story kind of takes them to a certain point in that conflict and then brings them to where they are at the end. Okay. The classic way of thinking about this kind of a story is that it has, as I've said before, some kind of rising action that brings us to this point. There's a moment where a climax occurs. And if you were Freytag, you would use this term greatest tension. That's where things get really crazy, when things become extreme and there has to be some kind of resolution, you know. And then that happens, you know, that climax occurs, and then there's some kind of resolution, or, you know, if you're a French critic, you could say denouement, where these stories are brought to some kind of a conclusion. Whether you like the conclusion or not is not really the point. We're talking here about the structure of a narrative. If we have some time, we'll talk about the idea of endings here. So that's kind of the basic structure of a story, that it starts in one place, ends in another. There's a rising action to a certain point, and then there's a falling action. Now, these pieces are not necessarily equivalent. You could have a story that has 20 pages of rising action, a one-page climax, and then that same page might contain the falling action and the conclusion. Other stories might have a climax occur very early on, and then there's all kinds of reverberations from that climax. And then some stories just end. Rose for Emily might be one that fits into that category. I'm not sure. Something else to think about is that originality in fiction is actually very difficult. As our textbook editors point out, that most stories tend to have universal types of characters, and there are, you know, literally thousands of types of characters: old people, young people, men, women, animals, you know, rich people, poor people, naive people, experienced people, innocent people, evil people, but they're all, you know, types of one kind or another. The real genius of an author is taking a type, a bad guy or a good guy, and making them fully fleshed out and human. And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about characterization. The other thing is situations. There's only so many plots that exist. And of course, Atwood offers you 6. There are literally perhaps dozens of other plots you could get into from those stories of John and Mary, this couple, and all the different permutations that they go through. But there certainly are some plots that will almost always recur in one way or another. We have the classic 2 that writers always talk about is Boy Meets Girl or Stranger Comes to Town. If you go back to A Party Down at the Square, that's a Stranger Comes to Town story. This young man from Cincinnati, a teenager, shows up in a town in the South, stays with his uncle, and experiences the horrors of the lynching that Ellison describes. That's not a Boy Meets Girl story. You've got other stories in here that might be Boy Meets Girl, or they have a piece of it. If you think about Why I Live at the P.O., that's the aftermath of a Boy Meets Girl story, because Mr. Whitaker has been met by both Sister and Stella Rondo. He chooses Stella Rondo, and then Stella Rondo comes back with a child under kind of murky circumstances. But what the impeller of the plot there is this boy meets girl story. We may not recognize that at first, but that's certainly one way to look at it. I'll leave you with a couple of questions here. One of the things that I think you're going to find interesting is how long a story is, how the timing works out, how does it keep our attention, what kind of actions and character interactions sustain us in the course of a story. One of the stories we're going to be reading in here is called The Dead, and it and whatever novel choice we make are going to be long, more complex texts than many of the short stories that we're reading. And when we're looking at those, one of the things we got to think about is how does the writer sustain our interest in this? Is it plot driven in the sense that there's action, 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 action? Or is it more character driven in that we're watching individual people come to life? We're looking at their motivations. We're looking at what they tell us about themselves. We're looking at what their other characters tell us about themselves. And so sometimes I'll have students who'll talk about stories being too long. And I think that's certainly something to consider. When you say that, you got to say, well, what exactly do you mean? Is it because there's not enough action to keep you going, or the characters themselves are just not interesting enough? Plot and character are interrelated, but they don't always drive each other in quite the same way that we might. One of the issues that comes up with characters is whether they change or not in the course of a story. In Party Down at the Square, for instance, the boy undergoes an interesting experience as a character. He develops a bit, but then he kind of falls back into the same sort of odd status as everybody else, all the other white people in the town are. And so the question is, the action in that story, the plot, how does it affect him? Does it change him in some way? And that's something for us to think about. Or is his character formed kind of in the beginning of the story, and he doesn't really change very much? He reverts to his normal self before this event. So plot and character interact on each other, but they can do it in odd kinds of ways. Something else to consider here is this idea of a happy ending. One of the questions I'll ask you, in fact, will be at various points is, which of these stories has a happy ending? And do we need a happy ending? Or are there some stories that just demand some other kind of ending? One that might be more ambiguous or more tragic, if we want to use that term. And so these are the kinds of questions that you sort of have to ask yourself in here. What makes a happy ending? How do we make those decisions? What makes for an ambiguous ending? Why should stories have ambiguous endings? Some people argue that they're ambiguous because human existence itself is ambiguous. We're not quite sure, many of us, what the purpose of human existence is. There are moments, many moments in our lives where things are not clear-cut, or not as clear-cut as we'd like them to be, or worse, perhaps, where we think things are clear-cut, and then we find out later they're not, that we've made some horrible error. And so we got to remember that fiction is a reflection of human experience. And just like we organize our daily lives chronologically as we go from thing to thing to thing, and we organize most of our lives in sort of a chronological arc of being born and growing up and getting educated and getting a job and maybe having a family and then getting old and, going to our great reward, that fiction reflects all that, and it reflects pieces of that human existence all the way through. So lots of things to think about, lots of things to consider as we read the stories for this week and as we read the stories for the rest of the term. But I thought it would be useful just to kind of point out that plot, structure, narrative all have real value within a story. And even though we might focus more on character from time to time, plot is what keeps us reading. Plot is what keeps the story going. Plot is where we get our causality from, why things happen and when they happen and how they happen. So it's an essential part of storytelling. I'll be interested to see what you have to say.